These two terrible engagements, which history may fairly record as giants' battles, cost the enemy 150,000 of its best troops, 50,000 of whom lay dead on the field of battle. Our loss amounted only to 50,000. Thus, the difference of our forces was considerably diminished, and a third engagement presented itself, with changes much more favorable. But our ammunition was exhausted. Our parks contained no more than 16,000 charges. We had fired 220,000 during the two preceding days. We were compelled to make arrangements for our retreat, which commenced during the night on Leipzig. At daybreak, the Allies assailed us. They entered Leipzig along with us, and an engagement commenced in the streets of the city. Our rear guard was defending itself valiantly, and without sustaining great loss, when a fatal occurrence ruined all. The only bridge across the Elster by which our retreat could be effected was, by some accident or misunderstanding, blown up. Thus all our forces on the Leipzig bank of the river were lost, and all on the opposite bank marched in haste and disorder upon Mentz. At Hanau, we were compelled to force a passage through 50,000 Bavarian troops. Only the wrecks of our army returned to France, and to render the misfortune complete, they brought contagion with them. Such was the fatal campaign of Saxony, our last national effort, the tomb of our gigantic power opposed to the united efforts of all the forces of Europe. And in spite of all the chances that were accumulated against us, the genius of a single man had, in course of this campaign, been 4 times on the point of restoring our ascendancy and cementing it by peace. After the victories of Lutzen and Bautzen, after the Battle of Dresden, at the time of the last movement on Berlin, and finally on the plains of Leipzig, Napoleon failed only by a complication of fatalities and perfidies of which history furnishes no example. I here note down only those which occur to me on a retrospective view of the events of this period. Fatalities: A. Sudden indisposition of Napoleon. B. Unexpected overflow of the Bober. C. Confidential letter from the King of Bavaria. D. Orders not transmitted to the corps at Dresden. E. Deficiency of ammunition after the 2 battles of Leipzig. F. Explosion of the bridge across the Elster. Perfidies. G. Machinations. N. Bad faith of Austria, the first and true cause of our disasters. H. Violation of the armistice of Pleiswitz relative to our blockaded fortresses. I. Desertion of the chief of the staff of the Third Corps. K. Defection of the Bavarian government. L. Treachery of the Saxons. M. Violation of the capitulation of Dresden. The following are a few lines of explanation. A. After the victory Dresden, someone complimented Napoleon on his great success. "Oh, this is nothing," observed he, while his countenance beamed with satisfaction. "Van Damme is on their rear. It is there that we must look for the great result." The emperor, proceeding in person to assist in accomplishing this decisive operation, when unfortunately after one of his meals he was seized with so violent a retching that he was supposed to have been poisoned, and it was found necessary to convey him back to Dresden. Thus the operations were interrupted. The fatal consequences that ensued are well known. How trivial was the cause, and how calamitous were the results. B. The sudden overflow of the Bober in Silesia was the principal cause of the disasters of Marshal MacDonald. His corps, while in full operation, were overtaken by the flood, which impeded their operations and caused the terrible losses which have been above described. C. About the end of September, the King of Bavaria addressed a confidential letter to Napoleon, stating that he would maintain his alliance with him for 6 weeks or 2 months longer, and that during that interval he would obstinately refuse every advantage that might be held out to him. The emperor, who was placed in a most critical situation, and who, but for this circumstance, might perhaps have lent an ear to the propositions that were made to him, now no longer hesitated, but immediately determined on the bold movement which he had contemplated on Berlin. He conceived that 6 weeks would be sufficient to change the state of affairs and remove the fears of his allies. Unfortunately, military intrigues proved more powerful than the wishes of the King of Bavaria. Napoleon was forced to suspend his movement and to give battle at Leipzig with disadvantage. The consequences have already been seen. Napoleon, in making his arrangements for the Battle of Leipzig, had relied on a diversion of the Army Corps, which he had left in Dresden. Their cooperation might have rendered the victory decisive and have given a new turn to affairs. But unfortunately, the enemy's force was so numerous, and we were so completely surrounded that the Emperor's orders could not be transmitted to Dresden. After the two terrible engagements at Leipzig, the French were effecting their retreat across the Elster by a single bridge. An officer who was stationed to guard it was ordered to blow it up if the enemy should present himself in pursuit of our rear guard. Unluckily, this officer was by some mistake or other informed that the Emperor wanted him. He immediately obeyed the summons, and in his absence, a corporal sappers, at the first sight of some detached Russian corps, fired the train and blew up the bridge, thus dooming to perdition that portion of our force which still remained on the Leipzig bank of the river. The whole of our rear guard and baggage, 200 pieces of artillery, and 30,000 prisoners, stragglers, wounded, and sick, fell into the hands of the enemy. On the publication of the bulletins containing this intelligence, a general outcry was raised by the discontented party of Paris. It was asserted that the whole was a fabrication and that the Emperor himself had ordered the blowing up of the bridge with the view of ensuring his own safety at the expense of the rest of the army. It was in vain to refer to the statement of the officer who confirmed that the fact, while he attempted to justify himself, this was declared to be another fabrication or a piece of complacence on the part of the officer. Such was the language of the time. The duplicity and bad faith of Austria, the numerous contradictions between her acts and her professions have already been mentioned. Unmindful of the generosity of which she had been the object after the battles of Leoben, Austerlitz, and Wagram, she discharged her debt of gratitude according to the rules of policy, and by eagerly seizing the opportunity of repairing her losses at any price, she ruined us by making us consent to the armistice of Pleiswitz, and her conduct was the more odious as she was determined to make war against us. And a few days afterwards, though still our friend and ally, and offering herself as a mediator, she entered into engagements hostile to us. Her participation in the conventions of Reichenbach about the middle of June, and in the conferences of Trachenberg at the commencement of July, are now well known. The necessity of maintaining a certain appearance of decorum occasioned these matters to be kept secret. For about a month after the commencement of hostilities, they were at first proposed to Francis merely as eventual and precautionary measures, and he was induced to affix his signature to them only by the representations of his ministers, who described Napoleon as the scourge of mankind and attributed to him the delays in the opening of the Congress, which were in reality occasioned by themselves. But in spite of the contact of Austria, Napoleon still cherished the hope of seeing her resume her alliance with him. Not that he could calculate on any misunderstanding between her and the other coalesced powers, but because he supposed her to be sufficiently clear-sighted with respect to her own interests. This idea never forsook him until the moment of signing his abdication. The fortresses occupied by French troops in those places which were in the possession of the Allied forces were to have a clear circuit of 1 league and to receive supplies of provisions every 5 days, but this article was not honestly fulfilled. When the armistice was prolonged, the French commissaries demanded that officers of their army should be sent to the commanders of the fortresses. But the Russian general-in-chief objected to this, and circumstances were such that we were obliged to give up the point. The chief of the staff of the Third Corps, a Swiss by birth but educated in our ranks, went over to the enemy a few days before the renewal of hostilities, taking with him all the information he could collect. For this service, the Emperor of Russia rewarded him with particular favor and made him one of his aides-de-camp. It has been said that this officer, who was possessed of great talent, had reason to complain of some injustice. But could anything palliate such an act or remove the disgrace attending it? Okay. Part of Napoleon's plan of campaign was that the Bavarian army stationed on the Danube should act in concert with the army of Italy stationed in Illyria, and that their combined efforts should be directed upon Vienna. The important effect which these measures must have produced on the fate of the campaign may be easily conceived, but the chief of the Bavarian army, under some pretext or other, but in reality because he had entered into an understanding with the enemy, remained constantly inactive and thus paralyzed the efforts of the vice king, who had to oppose the great bulk of the Austrian force. It has already been stated that the open defection of the Bavarians at the most critical moment of the campaign mainly contributed to bring about our disasters. But nothing equaled the infamous and disgraceful treachery of the Saxons, who, though they were then serving in our ranks and were our companions in danger and glory, suddenly turned to fight against us. Whatever might be the fatal effects of their desertion, the disgrace attached to themselves is greater than all the mischief they occasioned to us. The conduct of Napoleon during this period, when he was described as a monster of deception and bad faith, presents on the contrary an example of singular magnanimity. He had added a corps of Saxons to his imperial guard, but on the desertion of their countrymen, he ranged them round their sovereign, whom he left at Leipzig, releasing him from all his engagements. There were also some Bavarians in his army, and he wrote to their chief, informing him that Bavaria, having disloyally declared war against him, this circumstance would authorize him in disarming and detaining prisoners all the Bavarians in his service, but that such a measure would destroy the confidence which Napoleon wished that the troops under his orders should repose in him. He therefore ordered them to be supplied with provisions and disarmed. And I have before me the notes of a distinguished officer relative to the capitulation of Dresden, estimating the number of troops which we had left behind us in the fortresses from which we were separated. He concludes that they must have amounted altogether to 177,000. The emperor had but 157,000 men at Leipzig. How different, therefore, might have been our fate had those masses, or even a portion of them, been at his disposal in this decisive event. But this unfortunate dispersion was occasioned by extraordinary circumstances and was not the result of any regular system. The following particulars relative to the violation of the capitulation of Dresden are literally quoted from the notes above alluded to. Above all, it is necessary to understand that it was determined in the plan of the coalition against France, of which Prince Schwarzenberg had the credit, that according as offers were made for the capitulation of each of our numerous garrisons, the conditions should be fairly and honorably granted, but without any intention of fulfilling them. This point being established, the reason of the refusal of the capitulation signed at Dresden by Marshal Saint-Cyr and Generals Tolstoy and Clenau was that Prince Schwarzenberg should not ratify it, because the Count de Lobau, Napoleon's aide-de-camp, who was shut up in Dresden with the Marshal, had protested against the capitulation. Sometime after the capitulation of Danzig, which was signed with General Rapp, was declined under the odiously false pretense that the garrison of Dresden, in spite of the conditions of its capitulation, had entered into service immediately on its arrival at Strasbourg, and that in consequence the capitulation of Danzig could not be approved without incurring the risk of similar inconveniences. The following is an additional proof of the bad faith of the Allies. The garrison of Dresden, which was composed of 2 army corps forming altogether 45,000 men, capitulated on the 11th of November. According to the terms of the capitulation, the French were to evacuate the fortress in 6 columns and in 6 successive days, and were to repair through Strasbourg. This capitulation was fulfilled, so far at least, as regarded our evacuation of the fortress and its occupation by the enemy, but our 6th column had scarcely made a day's march from the town when it was announced that the capitulation was declined and rejected by the General-in-Chief, Prince Schwarzenberg, by an order of the 19th of November. When Marshal Saint-Cyr remonstrated against his conduct, it was proposed, by way of compensation for the injustice, that he should be permitted to re-enter Dresden with his troops, and and be again placed in possession of all the means of defense which he had before the capitulation. This was merely a piece of irony. In vain did the marshal negotiate for the literal fulfillment of the articles agreed upon by Count Clenel, who had possessed full powers for so doing. The unfortunate garrison, broken up and dispersed, was under the necessity of repairing to the different cantonments that were assigned to it in Bohemia instead of pursuing its march towards the Rhine. The marshal, indignant at this flagrant breach of faith, dispatched a superior officer to communicate the circumstance to Napoleon, but the Allies retarded his progress under various pretenses, and he did not reach Paris until the 18th of December. Subsequent events had by this time rendered the evil past all remedy. After the series of deceptions and perfidies which I have here disclosed, and which the Allies had established as a system, it is not surprising that Napoleon should have placed no reliance on the famous Declaration of Frankfurt, and that he should have felt indignant at the blindness of our legislative body, the committee of which, either from evil designs or mistaken views, completed the ruin of affairs. Napoleon assured me that he was several times on the point of summoning the members of this committee before him in order to consult with them confidentially and sincerely on the real state of things and the imminent danger with which we were threatened. Sometimes he thought he should undoubtedly bring them back to a right sense of their duty. Sometimes, on the contrary, he feared that obstinacy of opinion or mischievous intention might have involved the affair in controversy, which, considering the spirit of the moment, would have weakened our resources and hastened our dissolution.